Okay, so we're going to get started. So thank you very much for coming today. Now, you'll see, just so that a few housekeeping things, if you've got any questions, because we're covering a lot of content, feel free to just pop a message into the chat and I'll address them at the end of the session, just because that way we can get through everything, because I know some people are interested in some insights more than others. As I say, the recording will go out on Monday along with a copy of the slides, because I know that some people want to use those slides to show it to other people. You can access this recording if you, for some reason, don't get the link or want to come back to it later at the video on demand library at answers.net.au. But of course, as always, if you've got any questions, just send me an email. I'm always happy to answer any questions that you might have. But on to the research. So this research project came because after the COVID crisis first hit, I kept getting asked lots and lots of questions from people wanting to know what everyone else was doing and what they should do, and looking for ideas and insights about how to go forward. And it got to the stage where I was like, well, this is a bit crazy. We need some data. And this is where I got an awesome group of association executives together, and I see a few of them online here today. Hi, Lindsay. Who helped put together some questions. And I ended up with something like 130, and we managed to pare it down to just a little over 50. And when I sent it out, I was so happily surprised to see the volume of responses that we generated. There are actually over 600 responses generated, but when we went through and washed it and validated it all, we ended up with 426 associations who responded and 11 suppliers. So the data I'm going to talk about today is just from the association side of things. Most of them came from Australia, with a nice chunk of 10% from New Zealand. And when we talk about the rest of the world, that was mainly the UK and the US. But predominantly, it was really interesting to see that 38% were professional associations, another 38% were industry bodies. And when we look at things like what did they look like, it was really interesting to note that the majority of associations have got between 1 and 5,000 members, and most of them had a turnover between 100,000 and 3 million. Now, as we go through today, I'm not going to talk to everything on the slides, but I've tried to highlight where I thought it might be interesting for you to have a look through. Now, because we had such a large sample size, we had a lot of data, particularly the very large amount of free text responses. Thank you so much to everybody who sent those in. But by golly gosh, it took me an extra 2 weeks to do the analysis, because there was some wonderful feedback in there that really fed into the results here. Overall, so when we look at it, when we've gone into the crisis, everyone has said the short to medium term has been hard. It's been really hard, as associations have had to adapt in ways that, and at a speed that they've never had to do before. The level of innovation that we saw is larger than we saw even with the advent of the internet, which was a sort of a slower burn. The people got things done in 2 months that they never thought they could get done in 10 years. So I don't want to understate how difficult it's been for a lot of associations, with 73% saying that they were negatively impacted, either severely or somewhat. But the interesting thing comes when you're looking at the longer term outlook. When we look at the longer term outlook, most people believe it's going to have a neutral or positive effect on their associations. In fact, there was strong commentary throughout the free text responses about how that it drove innovation and increased their responsiveness and gave them a real clarity of purpose that they hadn't really felt that they had going into it. And those were the really good silver linings to this research that the associations have taken on. And that's been really fantastic to see, because a lot of them are reporting that they're already seeing the positive returns from these, and they're shedding the things that they didn't need to do anymore. But when we look through and we say, well, what is it that actually helped this? What are the things that made some associations able to adapt really effectively and others not so well? And these are what I call enablers. And when we went through, it was, and this is not just from this question, which the data shows the result here, but also through a lot of the free text responses, really strongly reinforced that associations who had a leadership team that could look at what needs to be done, articulate the vision through the crisis, and then were able to articulate that to the staff in such a way it was understood, and then to drive that strategy through the crisis, that was a huge impact. That was probably the #1 strongest. The second one was having the staff and volunteers with the skill sets, to be able to implement it, but also then thirdly, an organizational culture that was nimble and that embraced change, or at least was it was resilient enough for them to be coping with an ever-changing landscape. And it really reinforced how critical having the right staff, the right leadership, and really nurturing a great culture is, particularly in these times of crisis. And in fact, one of the things that was frequently reported in the crisis is where there wasn't a crisis plan, or where one had been done very, very fast, it was the organizational culture that drove the response. And that was fantastic to see in this sector. But let's have a look at through some of the specific areas. First of all, membership. As I said before, associations are innovating really, really quickly to meet the needs of different segments. And there's been a really interesting side effect from this. A lot of people reported that they're shifting into areas that aren't traditionally theirs, because we all know there's a bit of a unspoken demarcation between a lot of associations who may be somewhat competitive with each other. We've seen in the drive to deliver value to members, tangible value when they needed it, and to the right market segments, associations have had to pivot and create products and services that didn't even exist before. So what's happening now is we are seeing some crossover between associations. It's going to be interesting to see how that evolves moving forward. But when we looked through everything that people did, it could be grouped into one of these 8 categories from the responses that we got. A really big one was listening to members in a way that hasn't been done in such a coordinated manner previously, to actually figure out what do you need right now. And it really reinforces that whole idea of when you pay a membership fee, it's not a donation, it's an investment in the success of something. And for a business, it's an investment in the success of your business. For a person who joins a professional body, it's an investment in the success of your career. But often how we deliver the products to realize that success hasn't always been on point. But now we've been listening and we've responded specifically with what they need right now. As I say, expanding beyond the scope, quickly adopting the technology needed. The level of technology adoption has been incredible. And I'm not just talking about the shift to Zoom, but other areas that enable remote workplaces to operate. Making interactions with members more human, more engaging, empathic, more useful, and really looking at the why we're sending things was a really interesting output. And not only about how we talk to members, but the next one is how do we get members to talk to each other? The advent of these online communities, whether through Facebook, whether through private social networks, was really interesting to see how powerfully they contributed to the members' perception of value and what the association was able to deliver, not just to the members, but by helping the members talk to each other to get solutions. And that it made it more personal. The level of personal engagement, whether through the personal emails, interactive seminars, engaging on a human-to-human manner, really came through as one of the success factors in the commentary. And one of the really interesting things to note, and why this became particularly important, is we've always said that associations are about providing people with information. We've actually proven that's not the case. We're about providing people with insights, information that has been curated so that you're not drowning in an ocean of information, but instead you can go to your association and rely on getting information that's been curated so you're getting what you need when you need. And these were the 8 factors that came through most strongly in the responses that came through. But that's about the value. What about keeping members? Well, one of the interesting things that we saw is, despite the fact that member engagement has vastly gone up, it's not always translating into new members, and it's not going to translate into retention in some industries. There was some concerning commentary that came through, and it said even though member engagement has gone up, in industries which have been very, very severely affected, some of them are expecting, and the figures I've been quoting were terrifying, 30 to 50% of their members to go broke or to lose their jobs. Now that's terrifying. Now member retention in that kind of situation is going to be, of course, impossible if they're exiting an industry. One of the things that came through was this idea that when the JobKeeper in Australia here ceases in September, there was a lot of concern about an economic cliff that they're concerned were going to fall off, and what is the impact on the members, the association and the economy from this. And for this reason, while I look at this outlook for retention, for people in industries that have been moderately or only somewhat affected, their outlook was actually far more positive naturally. But I think only time will tell in terms of the final impact on member retention, because we haven't yet gone through this next area here. But what I would certainly say, in industries that have been badly affected, you need to be looking at restructuring your models and looking at how do we deal with this potentially smaller membership base, because in industries like that, your members are going to need you more than ever. So how do you need to, once again, I know there's more innovation in there, but to restructure your models and readapt your revenue streams to be able to survive through that yourself. But when we're looking at member renewals, this was another really interesting one. As people who've seen my sessions before know, I bang on about how fantastic direct debit is and how moving to these subscription style models is a trend that we're seeing more and more. The COVID crisis definitely pushed that ahead so much quicker, with 34% of people proactively promoting direct debit, and there was a reasonable proportion of those who had never offered it before. They're trying to make membership more accessible to people. The free or discounted membership for those in financial need was also, of course, very high up on there. I must admit, I was a little bit worried to see the free membership for all come through at 13% of people offering that, because that puts your organization often in a financially unsustainable position. If you've got the reserves to offer that and the vast majority of your members have been adversely affected, then I can understand doing it. Otherwise, it's an interesting one, and I think I'd like to drill back down into that one a little bit more. But it was really interesting to see that the uptake and the acceptance and the engagement with the idea of direct debit is not only going to be positive now, but into the future, because when you shift people onto direct debit, other research has shown that it generally will have a positive impact on retention, because you're working on the fact that people can be apathetic when it comes to these things, and if they have to take action not to renew, they're actually more likely to renew. I was interested too, there was a few people who reported we're not doing anything different from normal, but when I drilled down into that data and had a look, those are people whose renewal processes aren't until the end of the year, so they didn't need to take urgent action immediately. When we're looking at member recruitment, as I say, engagement's gone up, but if you look at the graph here, you can see that recruitment has stayed the same for most people. Only a few reported there that they've had an increase, but those who did have increases did exceptionally well out of it, and it was generally in industries like retail, nursing, doctors, where we saw that coming through. And those people who didn't report increases more often reported that they were gathering a large pool of warm leads of people that they'll be following up afterwards. So I think that the impact on member recruitment will be something that we'll see over the course of the next year or so, as people go back and have a bit of the time to go and look at those leads and talk to people about membership and ask the question. And of course, how we go with the upcoming recession. Now, membership's not the only thing in there which is a key revenue generator for associations. Events is another huge one. And the feedback on that was really interesting. There will 100% be permanent changes in the way that associations run events. 72% reported that they're going to be shifting to incorporating hybrid or online events with what they do. Now, if you look at that, the percentage of people who were using online beforehand was very, very small. But now people have done it, and it's been successful for a vast majority of people. It's actually added something new that they weren't doing before, but they potentially could have. Now, really interesting, the larger the association turnover, the more reliant on event, the larger the association's turnover, and the more reliant they are on event income, the more likely that shift is going to be, looking at the data. And concerningly, the smaller the organization, often the more likely are that it is that events are a large proportion of their revenue, which means for those organizations, they've really had to adapt, but they may wish to consider diversifying their income streams as well, so that they're not so reliant on what's going on in the event space. Now, interesting too, if you look there and the percentage of revenue that's generated from events, you can see that for a lot of associations, it's up to 50% of their revenue comes from it. So this isn't a small area, and it's one that needs a lot of attention. So we did that in the research. Knowing this, we drilled in. And we looked at, well, what's impacting, what destinations people are picking, what's impacting the delegate experience that they want to create, and most importantly, what are the priorities for event planners right now? And if I was, and I'm not going to read that whole slide to you, you can read the report, but if we were to just take the guts out of it and say, what is it? Right now, what event planners are trying to figure out is how do we make it as easy as possible for delegates to access quality content and connect with others in face-to-face, online and hybrid environments. But how do we do that in a financially sustainable manner? And those are the things that are really overridingly dominating the discussions and the feedback that was coming through. Because how do you monetize online events? We looked at a lot of the sponsors don't yet understand the value of the online events, but also for a lot of people, they're not effectively able to articulate that value or figure out mechanisms to create that value. Now, if you read the report, we put in a few ideas that people did, which I thought were very clever, but essentially if we're to be able to adapt effectively moving forward, the commoditization of things like webinars and the fact that they're so easy to access but so cheap takes away for some a huge cash flow boost that comes from these face-to-face events. And if I was to look at event planning, how do we monetize that effectively is going to be a major issue going forward that we need to address. And I'd love to do a little bit more research on this section because the feedback we got was phenomenal. But sponsorship is one of the things that's linked a lot to the events, and this is where the outlook was not so rosy. So everybody said that their sponsorship revenues have been sorry, not everybody, the majority of respondents said that their sponsorship revenues have been impacted. That's 56% said it was negative. But one of the things that really concerned me is, unlike with the association outlook and unlike with the membership outlook, the outlook for sponsorship was still remained not as positive as I would have hoped, with 51% predicting a negative long-term impact. So when this all happened, a lot of people did adapt as best as they could. A lot of people just postponed opportunities or substituted, and that's a start. But what do we do long term? Now, when we look and drilled into the free text response here, and there was so much in there, we found that there was a lot of concerns that people had about what's happening moving forward. Some of them were based in reality, and some of them were probably concerns that could be offset looking at how the sponsors themselves have been affected. Because if you look at the graph here, you can see for the majority of associations, it was really a half-half impact. It wasn't necessarily all of their members being adversely affected or all of their members being positively affected. And that one of the things that will be impacting on sponsorship into the future is, how did the crisis impact that sponsor and how are they responding to it? Right now, we're still closing some really big sponsorship deals. Even now, and even during the crisis, we were closing deals, but how we were closing them and what they looked like was vastly different. It has really shifted to short-term returns now with specific outcomes, and sponsors are looking for something where there is that understanding by the person seeking sponsorship of the impact of COVID on their organization and how they're seeking to adapt. Many are aware of this coming economic cliff that we're heading towards, and hopefully the government will be able to, and everyone will be able to save that off to some extent or minimize that, but everyone's aware of that, so they're trying to generate this short-term return. So associations are going to need to adapt. The other thing when looking at the future that came through is how associations responded to the crisis will also impact on their ability to pick up sponsors moving forward. We saw a lot of associations reported that they actually drew their sponsors closer, worked more closely with them, really gearing at ways to provide solutions to members and the sponsor and the association. And those people have a much more positive outlook because they've got those relationships there which have endured throughout. And of course, the third thing is people asking the question, well, how do we provide value? If we can't run face-to-face events, which is predominantly how we provided value in the past, they've got a negative outlook because they're saying, well, what do we do? What's the new value that we can provide? And the ability to look at what you have to offer and to package it in a way that provides short-term tangible value for sponsors while also providing some kind of positive to members, because we've always got to remember sponsorship is a three-way arrangement because your members are in there too. That's a big area that people are looking at moving forward. And one of the other themes that came through is a couple of people were really adversely affected by an over-reliance on one sponsor. And when that sponsor pulled during the crisis, it caused them huge angst. But others were reporting that they had too many to be able to service effectively. So the need to, in a more considered way, diversify the risk from your sponsorship revenue is a key consideration moving forward for a lot of associations to say, well, how do we have not too few, not too many, what can we charge and what is the right number of sponsors to have where we can realistically service them and build relationships with them and move it to more into this relationship rather than this transactional kind of arrangement, because the transactional arrangements were the ones that really suffered badly during this crisis. And of course, there is so much going on in our external environment at the moment. A lot of people reported back that because they're so concerned about the external environment, it was one of the factors for the negative outlook that they had. And what came through from this is the need to be nimble and to be constantly aware of what's going on and adapting your sponsorship arrangements to suit that. So there's a lot of work to be done there, but if we're reevaluating member value propositions, it's a great opportunity then to look at what you can be doing with your sponsorship as well. We're seeing some really creative ones coming forward. Advocacy, this was so exciting. I can't even begin to tell you. The number of people who reported that the government reached out to them during the crisis was extraordinary. People who reported that they were on WhatsApp chats with a couple of ministers and getting hourly updates. And one of the overriding things that we saw is where there was a positive relationship with government entering into the COVID crisis, you were far, far more likely, as you can see from that graph, to have them approach you or for them to be receptive to your approaches when the crisis hit. And unequivocally, I think this data shows that an investment in developing good, positive relationships with government makes you much more likely to be part of the solution rather than left out of the tent when these kind of things happen. The next thing we looked at is boards. One of the really interesting things is this is shown, is there's been a really quick change to the way that some boards run. Now, association boards tend to be interesting beasts because a lot of them are based on Robert's Rules of Order, which were done in 1887 when you had 6 months to consider a decision. And one of the common complaints about association boards is, as visionary as great as they might be, sometimes the structures behind them aren't what we'd call nimble. So one of the things that this has brought on is an overriding requirement to immediately become nimble. And there was a lot of answers to this question, but when you group them, the 7 impacts that have been most powerful coming forward is the shifts in the way that boards function and meet. So there's a lot of people who are now not only shifted to online board meetings, but have found that they work and plan to continue. Shifts in the way that boards determine strategy, short, sharp online strategic planning where everybody gets involved. And quick decision making there. Certainly a better delegation of responsibilities where the board is setting strategy, putting in place really great ways to short-term monitor that strategy and undertake oversight, but really delegating to the CEO the ability to quickly execute it to get it done. Really interesting to see the way that a lot of board members were getting involved with key stakeholders, whether that be securing donors, sponsors, government, even getting out there and engaging with members to try and help the association through this time. And of course, as you'd expect, a lot of people reported that the board became much more active in helping to secure the financial position of the association and undertaking what needed to be done to make that happen. One of the things I thought was a wonderful outcome is that more people reported that their boards were willing to undertake fundamental changes, and quite a few people reported dramatic changes to business models, new strategies, changing the constitution, all of these things which they expected to take months, if not years, were through in a couple of weeks. And that refresh that's allowed, that innovation and that change is something that will have an enduring positive impact. And also one of the really interesting things that we saw was the willing to collaborate with other associations. A large number of people reported that they were able to achieve positive impacts for their members through collaboration, whether that be through advocacy or sharing of resources and things like that. That ability for everyone to come together was fantastic. Cash flow, something that truly surprised me was the amount of reserves that people had. 93% of people had at least 3 months in reserves, and a huge proportion actually had 6 months and more. Now, that doesn't mean that they were the cash rich. A lot of those funds had to go to adaptation, and a lot of organizations to achieve that security undertook things like salary reductions and things like that to try and preserve that lump sum that they had. Certainly financial support, a lot of people reported that was essential for them to being able to pivot effectively and also to retain their staff. And that once again, going back, a lot of people have said when it goes, that's going to be a really sudden cut, and that may have some impact on their ability to retain people. And speaking of staff, one of the things that was really interesting with this is that the crisis has created a permanent shift in association staffing models. Now, if you look at the graph there, you can see that most associations, 55%, have between 1 and 9 staff. So we found that there were already 4% who were working, sorry, 12% who were already working from home. So the crisis didn't have too much an impact on them. But interestingly, while at 96% of association staff worked at home for some or all of the crisis, there are 4% who said that it's going to be permanent. And really, it was only 10% said that they intend to go back to how things were before. And the commentary that was provided was really interesting, because a lot of people suggested that this has actually worked exceptionally well for them. And a lot of the concerns that they'd had about working from home on productivity, staff engagement, etc., had been overcome, or they could see pathways to overcome it. So I think what we're going to see moving forward is a really interesting situation now, because associations who are more amenable to work from home models suddenly have their world opened up in terms of where they can recruit staff from. And it makes them more able to get the right people for the right job if they're not constrained by something as like geography, which really shouldn't factor into it too much. So the other thing that was interesting to note with staffing is the impact on staff numbers and working hours for predominantly wasn't impacted. Most people said, as you can see from the graph there, that it stayed the same. But, and I have raced to keep in time here, I wanted to go through what did we learn? Because we did all this research, and yes, it was a massive job and fascinating, but realistically, what does that mean for us moving forward? And that's why I did this slide, and all of this is in the report as well, but this is what do we need to do for the future now? So looking at that, a skilled board and senior leadership team, absolutely critical, and governance practices that support that. The ability to have nimble and adaptive decision-making processes. One of the things that came through from everybody was that ability to be quick in response was a critical element for their success. And that means we need better reporting. We don't just need to send our board or look at a giant list of who's our members or a giant spreadsheet that doesn't mean anything. When we talk about enhanced reporting, it's about reporting that provides clarity and clear direction about where is our membership heading, what is our financials like, how are our events performing, and not just now, but from a trend base. How is that compared to last year, the year before that? Trend-based analysis, really giving people the insights necessary to make evidence-based, well-informed decisions on the future of their organizations and the various elements of that. Things like looking, are members taking up certain products and services? And if they're not, why do we still have them? Do we need to analyze, do we need them to better reinvest our limited resources? Because one of the things that also came through from there is the ability to keep some put away reserves. But you don't want to do that at the expense of services. So when you are investing in services, you want to make sure you're putting it into the right ones. Crisis planning and preparedness, that's certainly something that came through very strongly. Diversified revenue streams. The associations that were most negatively hit were the ones that seemed to have more reliance on 1 or 2 income streams, and really strongly came through that need to, how else can we generate revenue? Membership structures as well. The crisis led to this more of a shift towards the subscription models with this movement to direct debit, which is fantastic. But what do we need to do to have a structure that enables us to execute and service our members and non-members effectively? The number of people who were servicing large non-member databases through this crisis, what are the frameworks you've got for that in future that enable you to actively engage with these people who are valid prospects for memberships, to bring them along that journey into membership and into being more closely with the association? Often a lot of association membership models at the moment don't lend themselves easily to that. The events portfolio, really looking at something that has that diversity of online, offline, and hybrid events, all geared at different markets as well. And I was talking with a client a couple of days ago, and I love the way that she divided hers is into doers, managers, and leaders, recognizing that you need to do different types of events for each of those groups: the doers who actually execute the work, the managers, the people who look after, and the leaders who set the strategy, because they're after different things. And are we segmenting our events effectively to be able to do that? Once again, the working from home processes and practices, there was a lot of people reported that certain technology that help them to manage tasks, really help to improve the execution of outcomes from working at home. So looking at how do we optimize those so that we give ourselves the security that we need to continue that trend. A big thing that came out was the internal communications processes and systems, basically looking at ways that we can optimize our workflows and implement technology so that we can streamline operations. So if a staff member is off sick with COVID, as I had a few, then it doesn't affect the operations of the association, because if the majority of your staff are between 1 and 9 and one person goes down, you need to have things in place that make sure that their role is optimized to the point where someone can step in if necessary, and making sure that the experience for members and the outcomes they're achieving are as impacted as little as possible. And that was why the need to invest in technology. And when we talk about investing in technology, it's not just about the software. A number of people reported they had the software, but the staff didn't know how to use it. So when you're looking at investing in technology, it's a holistic approach to the organization to say, how can we use this to get our operational efficiencies and automate our processes and deliver an amazing experience for members? And how can we make sure that every staff member, including those new people who might come on after the technology is implemented, can use it to its fullest possible extent? Because it was really sad to see the number of people who have really good tech systems in there, but couldn't optimize those because the staff just didn't have the training. Other things that come through is the collaborative advocacy approach, working with others, developing relationships with government, and basically collaborating with other associations to reduce duplication and enhance outcomes for professions, industries, and other areas that you might represent. The communication with members, one of the things that came through really strongly from the results was where the communications with members was very powerful and emotive, yet empathic and useful. They got a much better take up. And the last two things here, it doesn't apply to everyone, but those who need stocks of goods, to have larger stocks for those that are mission critical. And lastly, to act now and don't wait. So many people regretted not acting when they should have acted. So look, I just want to take this moment too to say thank you to the Northern Territory Business Events who actually, their support made this all possible. And I know I've flown through it in half an hour, but I know that half an hour is pretty much all of us have got these days. But if you've got any questions, let me know. I'm going to load this up. I'll answer if anyone wants to pop any into the chat now. But you'll get an email with the report that'll come out by Monday morning. If you go to answers.net.au, you can watch it there, and you've got my email address. But thank you very much. It was wonderful to have you along on that very sharp ride, and I will stick around for a moment or two if anyone does have any questions. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. The audio recording will come through in the email. Yes, Julie, I'll send it all through. Alex said trends for future events. Yes, it really did. There was a lot of people who are keen to get back to face-to-face events as soon as possible. Some reported that they were already planning to run them and depending on the area too, and the state and the country, when they were going to run those was going to be quite different. So yeah, but a lot of people said face-to-face as quickly as possible, but the way they're going to run those face-to-face events is quite different. Standout productivity tool except for Zoom. There were a few, but you put me on the spot to try and remember what they were. In fact, Lindsay, if he's still in there, it had a great one for task management. But there were quite a few. I'll compile a list and see if I can't include something about the productivity tools. Because there was quite a few. In fact, I think it'd be worthwhile running a session where everyone can put in what their best was, because I had so many reports from people using these amazing little pieces of software that I'd never even heard of before. The prohibitive cost of hybrid events. Actually, funnily, no. The people talked about how they were going to manage, how they were going to afford them, but they didn't say that. I didn't have anyone say it was going to be cost prohibitive. A lot of people were saying we just need to find a way to do it. But for a lot of them said it wasn't going to be the whole event. The things they were talking about hybridizing may have been more affordable than the stuff that you've been looking at. But it was really interesting to see that getting that interaction between the online delegates and the offline delegates was something people were keen to figure out pathways to do. And I don't think people are really, there was no one in there who said they'd come up with a full solution though, which was interesting. It's the event side of things I would love to do more research on, because a few people sent me links to things, and I think I put one in the document for different types of online conferences and the way that different things were being advertised. And I think we're going to see a huge amount of innovation in events over the next 6 months. And I think the next piece of research that I will be doing will be onto how associations have adapted their conferences, exhibitions, training, etc., into the new environment. Any other questions at all? Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for those of you that are left, and I look forward to talk to you again next time. See ya.